An always relevant topic, plus a thumbnail from the most recent Kanto. Yeah, no surprise that went well. Anyways, time to put more effort into a video that will be lucky to get half as many views. Woohoo! So, now that we're done with player-side topics, let's get into what being a game master is like. I'm not going to focus too much on the general idea of being a GM, but I know some of you guys are new to the hobby, so let's quickly go over the basics. As a GM, your role is to facilitate the story, creating fair and meaningful challenges for the players. It's not a role for everyone, and it's a good bit of responsibility. You'll need prep time, the ability to get players together and manage them, and the ability to create engaging NPCs. An important thing to understand as a GM is that you're not telling the story alone. Your players should have some agency as well. In exchange, the players should show respect to your story and engage with it on its terms. No going full murder hobo. Everyone is here to have fun, so if something isn't working, talk it out. Now then, onto more specific advice for this system. As stated in previous episodes, this game is meant to be split into missions, which represent major checkpoints in your campaign. It's up to you to put together the structure and story that your players will go through. My recommendation is that each mission should take about 2 to 3 sessions, assuming each session is about 4 hours. Of course, your group's preference will take priority, and I think the first mission should probably be shorter, 1 or 2 sessions. Narrative play is pretty freeform. My main tips are just to make sure the mission is linear enough that your players won't be left directionless, but still freeform enough to let your players have an impact on the narrative. The best way to accomplish this is mainly to plan out one mission at a time. If you start cooking late-game missions too early, and your players choose to follow a different path than intended, you'll be left with a lot of leftover ideas. That's not to say don't plan ahead, but keep things to broad strokes, rather than anything in depth. Now, combat and narrative play is intentionally separate in this system, but there can be some overlap, specifically in how you start combat. There's no hard rules for this, but if the players do something to gain or lose the upper hand, you can add some modifiers to the start of battle. Maybe the enemies start off with less light if they were caught unawares. Maybe they start with less stagger resist if the battlefield was made chaotic beforehand. Maybe they start with debuffs if the players manage to use environmental effects. Whatever you do, I recommend keeping it to the start of battle, so that it's effective but doesn't invalidate the challenge. Also, during major story battles, you can pause the combat to add a narrative interlude that can have similar consequences. Think of stuff like the choice events in Limbus Company, particularly those during boss battles. You don't need to have set options, you just need to be able to set enough of a scene that players will have ideas of what they can do. Now, the thing you are waiting for. Combat balancing. I intentionally don't have a set guide for encounter design, but I can give you a basic idea of what enemies to throw against your party. First off, I'd say difficulty is best considered relative to the major improvements your party has obtained. Particularly, the first 2 or 3 are big boosts in power. Each individual level still has benefits, but it doesn't matter too much for the sake of encounter balance. For regular enemies, they're sorted into the following design categories, based on their speed dice total and light regen. There are 1-1 enemies, 1-2 enemies, and 2-2 enemies. Each are meant to be used 1-to-1 with players of certain level ranges. 1-1 enemies have 1 speed die and 1 light regen. They're meant to be roughly equivalent to characters of level 1 to 3, and their skills reflect this. They aren't too much of a threat, and are meant to be retired pretty quickly after reaching level 4, only to return later in large groups. 1-2 enemies have either 1 speed die and 2 light regen, or 2 speed die and 1 light regen. I usually design at least 2 kinds of these per faction, a fast damage dealer and a powerful tank. These enemies are meant to be used against players of levels 4 to 7 as equal opponents, but can be used earlier in lesser numbers, or later as fodder enemies. Their roles are significantly more powerful than 1-1 enemies, and will often require much more of a strategy to counteract. For levels 8 and onward, players should probably be going 1-1 with 2-2 enemies for most of the campaign. 2-2 enemies, predictably, have 2 speed dice and 2 light regen. They also have fairly powerful skills and passives. Not all 2-2s are made equal, but they should be similar enough to not worry too hard. Eventually, 2-2 enemies might not quite be on the level of players anymore, in which case you can either throw in 1 extra enemy, or replace an enemy with a mini-boss. Speaking of bosses and mini-bosses, they're a little harder to balance. I don't have a formula for these. The only advice I can give is to make sure that the number of light regen and speed dice on both sides are roughly equal, with counter dice serving as a way to substitute for more speed dice without giving an annoying amount of actions to a singular boss. Now, a lot of people are curious about how much info should be shared with players during combat. I plan to write this down on the document at some point, but let's cover my opinions. This system is built with the intent that most info should be available at some point. At minimum, anything that actively comes up should be explained to the players. The more that is explained, the more complicated you can make things, and the more agency players will have to fight back. Skills should be fully explained when used, but only after the player has declared their opposing skill. Figuring out the enemy's kit based on skill names is an intended part of the early scenes of combat. Passives should be explained once they come into effect. The exception is passives that dictate the gimmick of a fight. For example, Funeral of Dead Butterflies uses a powerful AoE skill if an enemy is staggered at the end of each scene. You want to let players know because it raises the stakes of the battle and lets them know what to avoid. Affinities, as well, should be given when they first come up. If you hit with a Pierce dice, you should learn what the enemy's Pierce affinities are, etc. HP, Stagger Resist, and Total Light can depend on your medium. If you're playing in person, it's probably better to just note when the enemy is looking injured. If you're using a virtual tabletop, having the value fully displayed is my preferred method. One thing that should always be clear are speed dice and light regen. Not only are they used to gauge the power of an enemy, but speed dice need to be public to establish the turn order. Finally, I'm going to give you some recommendations on resources to use. First off, there are some cool virtual tabletops you can use if you're playing online. Roll20 is my preferred method, being easily accessible with decent customization, but it can also be pretty janky. Foundry is a common favorite. It's very customizable if you want to get into some more technical stuff, and there might just be something coming up later to make things a bit easier. I've heard Owlbear is somewhat popular, but I don't know enough about it to truly recommend it. There's also Tabletop Simulator. I find it more useful for board games than tabletop RPGs, but a fan did create a special setup for the system, so I figured I'd give it a shout out. For character creation, if you aren't much of an artist, you can use Hero Forge to create a 3D model you can use. There's also Picrew, which has a lot of fan-made sets for creating Project Moon characters. While there isn't map-focused combat in this game, you can use a map maker program like Incarnate to create maps of dungeons, or your home base, or even just backgrounds for battle. They've got sci-fi and fantasy, so that should cover most of the aesthetics you'd need for the setting. Alright, that covers what I wanted to start with. If you have any other advice you'd like to see in the next few episodes, let me know. For some small updates on what's going on, I've recently started streaming a casual LobCorp playthrough, as casual as LobCorp can get anyways, so join in if you feel like it. There won't be much of a schedule, and it'll just be whenever I feel like streaming. I also plan to release the work-in-progress downtime rules pretty soon, so look forward to that. I'll see you next time with a guide on how to balance custom content. Bye bye!